The snow fell in thick curtains across the frozen marshland, each flake adding another layer to the treacherous landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The ice beneath their boots cracked with every step, revealing glimpses of black water that promised a frozen death to anyone careless enough to break through. Sergeant Raina Hale pressed her gloved hand against the rough bark of a frost-covered pine, steadying herself as another gust of Arctic wind tore through the forest. Echo Squad had been moving through this godforsaken terrain for 6 hours, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since they'd crossed the river at dawn. Raina's breath came out in white clouds that crystallized instantly on her scarf. Behind her, the rest of the 8-member unit trudged through knee-deep snow, their thermal signatures barely visible through the curtain of falling ice. Corporal Marcus Webb, the squad's communications specialist, muttered that command was out of their minds sending them through here, his voice carrying poorly through the wind, but Raina heard the exhaustion in it. He noted that this weather was only getting worse. Lieutenant Owen Price, their squad leader, raised his fist in the signal to halt. The team froze instantly, weapons raised, eyes scanning the white void around them. Raina dropped to one knee, her custom rifle already at her shoulder, scope sweeping the tree line. Years of training had made the movement automatic, instinctive. Price said quietly into his radio that something was wrong, that it was too quiet. Raina knew what he meant. Even in winter, a marsh this size should have some sound to wind through hollow reeds, ice-shifting distant birds. But this silence felt deliberate, manufactured, like the world itself was holding its breath. She had earned her place in Echo Squad 3 years ago, after a training exercise where she'd hit a moving target at 1,800 meters in a sandstorm. The instructors had called it impossible. Raina had simply called it Tuesday. But her reputation came with whispers. She was too cold, too detached, too mechanical. They said she didn't feel fear, which made her dangerous to work with. What they didn't know was that Raina felt everything. She just refused to let it show. 2 years ago, she'd made a mistake. A rush shot, a miscalculation in wind speed. Her spotter, Staff Sergeant David Chen, had been exposed when she fired too early. The enemy had triangulated their position from the muzzle flash. David had died pushing her out of the kill zone, taking 3 rounds meant for her. Since then, Raina had worked alone, no spotter, no partner. Just her rifle, and the math of death at long distance. Price ordered them to set up camp, gesturing to a cluster of pines that offered minimal shelter. They would move at 0-400 and needed to stay sharp. The squad dispersed with practiced efficiency. Raina chose a position on the perimeter, 40 meters from the main camp, where she could watch the approaches. She cleared snow from beneath a low, hanging evergreen branch, creating a small hollow that would hide her thermal signature while giving her clear sight lines. As darkness fell, she performed her evening ritual, checking every component of her rifle, running her fingers along the barrel, testing the scope's focus. The weapon was a custom-built chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, capable of accuracy at ranges that most snipers considered theoretical. Around 200 hours, Raina noticed something, a flash of reflected light, too brief to be natural, about 800 meters northeast. She marked it mentally but didn't report it. Not yet. Could have been ice catching moonlight. Could have been something else. An hour later, she heard it. A faint metallic clink, equipment brushing against metal. Then another sound, almost imperceptible, boots on frozen ground, but with a rhythm that didn't match any of her squadmates. Raina keyed her radio twice, the silent alert signal. In the main camp, she saw Price's head turn toward her position. She pointed northeast, held up 8 fingers, then made a circling motion. 8 contacts. Surrounding them, Price's response was immediate but calm. He began quietly waking the squad, getting them into defensive positions without creating obvious movement. But Reyna knew it was already too late. The tracks in the snow around their position were days old, covered and recovered by fresh snowfall. Whoever was out there had been watching them for miles, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect ambush point. The attack came at 0547, in that gray moment before sunrise when the world exists in shadow and the human eye struggles to distinguish shapes from darkness. Reyna was already awake, had been for hours, watching the tree line through her thermal scope. When the first drone appeared, it was small, nearly silent, hovering just above the marsh grass 300 meters out. A reconnaissance drone, civilian-grade but modified, which meant their attackers were well-funded, well-trained, or both. She was reaching for her radio when the marsh exploded. Smoke grenades detonated from 3 sides simultaneously, creating an instant fog bank that turned their thermal optics useless. Through the haze, Reyna heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire, not the random spray of insurgents, but the disciplined volleys of professional soldiers. Webb shouted that they had contact front, his voice nearly drowned out by explosions. Reyna rolled left as rounds tore through the pine branches above her head, showering her with frozen needles and wood chips. She crawled toward a fallen log, her rifle held close to her body, mind automatically calculating angles and distances even as chaos erupted around her. Through gaps in the smoke, she caught glimpses of the assault. At least 20 attackers moving in coordinated fire teams, using the terrain with expertise that spoke of extensive training. They wore no identifying patches, but their equipment was top-tier night vision, body armor, suppressed weapons. Echo Squad was fighting back, but they were outnumbered and caught in a kill zone. Price was shouting orders, trying to organize a fighting retreat toward higher ground, but the smoke was too thick, the enemy too close. Reyna found a shooting position behind the log and acquired her first target, a squad leader directing his team with hand signals. She put the crosshairs on his center mass, exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the man drop. But for every enemy she eliminated, 3 more appeared. They were using doctrine. She recognized Russian special forces tactics modified for asymmetric warfare. An explosion to her left shook the ground. A grenade had detonated near her position, close enough that the concussive wave slammed into her like a physical blow. Her ears rang, vision blurred. She tasted copper and realized she'd bitten her tongue. Through the disorientation, she heard Webb's voice on the radio saying they were everywhere, that they couldn't continue. The transmission cut off. Reyna blinked away, the blood trickling into her left eye, and raised her scope again. What she saw made her stomach drop. The smoke was clearing, and Echo Squad's positions were being overrun. Not killed but captured. The attackers were using non-lethal tactics where possible, disabling rather than executing. They wanted prisoners. She watched helplessly as Price was forced to his knees, hands tied behind his back. Webb was already unconscious, being dragged toward a collection point. The rest of the squad, Martinez, Cooper, Hayes, Sullivan, Park, were all being systematically subdued and secured. Reyna started to move, to help, to do something, when the marsh beneath her gave way. The ice she'd been lying on, weakened by her body heat and the concussive force of the grenades, cracked with a sound like breaking glass. She plunged into black water so cold it stopped her breath, shocked every nerve ending, sent her body into immediate crisis. The water was only 4 feet deep, but the mud at the bottom sucked at her legs like quicksand. She struggled upward, gasping, her rifle somehow still clutched in numb fingers. The fallen log above her had shifted, creating a natural cave of branches and ice that hid her from view. Above, she heard voices speaking in accented English. Boots crunched on ice directly overhead. Someone reported that 8 prisoners were secured and they were moving to the extraction point. Another voice confirmed and ordered a rally at Grid Echo 7, with transport estimated at 20 minutes. The voices faded, the footsteps receded, and then there was only the sound of wind through frozen reeds and Raina's own labored breathing. She was the only one who hadn't been captured. She was also alone, soaked through in sub-zero temperatures with no backup and no way to call for help. Webb's communications equipment was now in enemy hands. Raina pulled herself from the water, moving with mechanical precision despite the cold that was already sapping her strength. Hypothermia would kill her in less than an hour if she didn't get dry and warm, but there was no time for that luxury. She had watched her entire squad disappear into the morning mist, and she was the only one who could bring them back. Raina's fingers were blue when she finally managed to strip off her soaked outer layer. She was shaking so violently that it took 3 attempts to unzip her pack and pull out the emergency thermal blanket. Hypothermia wasn't just cold. It was a predator, stalking her with patient inevitability. She found a hollow beneath a massive pine where the branches had created a natural shelter thick enough to block the wind and snow. The ground was relatively dry, covered in a bed of brown needles that had been protected from moisture. She wrapped herself in the thermal blanket and forced herself to do controlled breathing exercises, bringing her core temperature back from the edge of dangerous. The marsh spread around her like a frozen wasteland, beautiful and lethal. Every crack of ice, every gust of wind carried the possibility of discovery or death. But more terrifying than the cold or the enemy was the silence, the absence of her squad's voices, the knowledge that 8 people who trusted her were now prisoners because she hadn't spotted the ambush in time. David's face flashed in her memory, the way he'd looked at her in that final second before pushing her clear, knowing he was about to die. She'd failed him. Now she'd failed Echo Squad. She stopped that thinking and focused on what she could control. Raina pulled out her personal optics, a high-end thermal monocular she'd bought with her own money, compact enough to survive the water. She scanned the marsh systematically, sector by sector, looking for heat signatures. There, 2 kilometers northeast, she picked up movement. Multiple figures closely grouped, moving through the marsh in a tactical column. That had to be the enemy unit with her captured squad. They were heading deeper into hostile territory, toward what she assumed was their base of operations. She checked her rifle. The weapon had survived the dunking. Military-grade rifles were designed to function after water immersion, but she'd need to field strip and dry it properly before attempting any long-range shots. That would take time she didn't have. The squad would be interrogated, possibly tortured. Every minute they remained in enemy hands decreased their chances of survival. Raina made the calculation coldly. She could attempt to reach friendly lines, report the situation, wait for a rescue operation that might take days to organize. By then, Echo Squad would likely be dead or moved to a location impossible to track. Or she could do what she'd been trained to do: hunt. The marsh was treacherous, but it was also an ally. The enemy wouldn't expect pursuit from a single operator through this terrain. They'd be focused on moving their prisoners quickly, getting them to a secure location before command realized Echo Squad had missed their check-in. Raina gave herself 10 minutes to dry her rifle and prepare. She worked with the efficiency of long practice, breaking down the weapon, clearing every component, reassembling with hands that had stopped shaking. She changed into her one set of dry underlayers, sacrificing warmth for the flexibility she'd need. Her ammunition count: 32 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum against 20, plus enemy combatants. The math wasn't in her favor, but math had never stopped her before. She began tracking, moving through the marsh with the patience of someone who understood that speed without stealth was just suicide with extra steps. The enemy had left a trail bootprints in snow, disturbed ice, broken vegetation. They were moving fast, prioritizing speed over concealment, confident that no pursuit would come through this frozen hellscape. They were wrong. After 90 minutes of careful tracking, Reyna found an elevated position, a rocky outcrop that rose about 50 meters above the marsh floor. It was exposed, windswept, and absolutely the worst place a rational sniper would choose for a hide. The gusts here were chaotic, swirling, impossible to predict with any consistency. But it was also the only position within 3 kilometers that offered a clear line of sight to where the enemy was taking her squad. Through her scope, at maximum magnification, she could see them, a cleared area near an old ranger station, now converted into a temporary holding facility. The prisoners were being held in what looked like a reinforced storage building. Guards patrolled the perimeter, more clustered near vehicles. Reyna pulled out her rangefinder and took a reading. 2,897 meters, nearly 3 kilometers. She had made successful shots at 200 meters before. The longest confirmed sniper kill in history was just over 500 meters, made by a Canadian Special Forces operator with ideal conditions and multiple spotters. Reyna had neither ideal conditions nor spotters. She had brutal crosswinds, falling snow, sub-freezing temperatures that would affect her ballistics, and the knowledge that her squad would die if she didn't try. She began her calculations. Reyna's hands were bare as she assembled her shooting position. Despite the cold that made her fingers ache, she needed to feel everything: the texture of the rock, the vibration of wind, the exact pressure points where her rifle would rest. Gloves dulled sensation, and at 2,900 meters, even the smallest variable could mean the difference between a clean hit and a complete miss. She arranged stones carefully, creating a stable platform that would absorb recoil without shifting. The rifle needed to be perfectly level, perfectly supported. Any cant, even a fraction of a degree, would send the bullet wildly off target at this distance. Next came the most critical task: reading the wind. At normal combat ranges, wind was a manageable variable. But at 3 kilometers, wind became the primary factor determining success or failure. The problem was that wind wasn't consistent. It varied by altitude, by terrain, by the temperature gradients between ground and air. Reyna pulled out a small notebook, worn from years of use, and began recording observations. She watched snowflakes fall, noting how they drifted and swirled. She studied the movement of branches in the valley below, seeing how trees at different elevations swayed with different rhythms. Professional snipers used wind meters, weather stations, ballistic computers. Reyna had her eyes, her experience, and a technique she'd learned from an old Marine Corps instructor who'd served in Vietnam. She plucked several strands of her own hair and held them up, feeling how they moved in the wind. Hair was sensitive enough to detect even subtle air currents. She tied the strands to small stones and placed them at different positions around her shooting platform, creating a crude but effective wind detection system. Then she began to breathe slow, controlled breaths that lowered her heart rate, bringing her body into the state she thought of as the calm. Her pulse dropped from its normal 60 beats per minute down to 50, then 45. The world seemed to slow, sounds becoming distant, vision narrowing to perfect clarity. This was the trance state that only the best snipers could achieve, a place where the body and mind worked together with mechanical precision, where training and instinct merged into something that looked like intuition, but was actually the result of 10,000 hours of practice. Her heart rate settled at 44 beats per minute, perfect. Through her scope, she studied the ranger station in detail. Guards changed position every 15 minutes, standard protocol. The prisoners were being held in the main building, visible through windows when guards opened the door. She counted heads. All 8 members of Echo Squad accounted for. But there was a problem. The shots she needed to make weren't just difficult, they required a sequence. She'd need to eliminate the immediate threat to her squad, which meant identifying who was in command, who had his finger on a trigger pointed at her people. At 2,900 meters, she couldn't see faces clearly, but she could see body language, posture, the way other soldiers deferred to certain individuals. There, a man in the center of the compound, pointing, giving orders. That was the commander. If she could take him out first, the chaos might give her squad a chance to act. But there was something else she needed to consider. David. The memory came unbidden, as it always did when she was preparing for a critical shot. David's voice in her ear, steady and calm, calling corrections about wind and target movement. She'd had a spotter then, someone to catch the variables she missed, to confirm her calculations, to share the immense responsibility of taking a human life at long distance. Now she was alone. Reyna pulled out her ballistic data book and began calculating. Bullet drop at 2,900 meters with her specific ammunition load was 29.7 meters. The Coriolis effect. The rotation of the Earth would actually deflect her bullet slightly, 8 centimeters to the right at this latitude. Temperature was -15 Celsius, which would slow the bullet's muzzle velocity by approximately 20 feet per second. She worked through the math with mechanical precision, double-checking every calculation. Then she made adjustments to her scope, dialing in elevation and windage based on her best estimates. The wind was the variable she couldn't fully predict. It would change between the moment she fired and the moment the bullet arrived. She'd need to make her best guess and trust her instincts. Through the scope, she saw movement at the ranger station. Guards were assembling the prisoners outside. This was wrong. Why move them? Unless they were about to transport them to a more secure location or execute them. Reyna's pulse spiked, threatening her calm. She breathed deeply, forcing the panic down. Getting emotional now would make the shot impossible. She had one chance, 4 seconds of bullet flight. 2,900 meters of uncertainty, and 8 lives depending on her making the most difficult shot of her career. She settled into position, cheek welded to the stock, eye aligned perfectly with the scope. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, feeling the slight resistance of the mechanism. The world narrowed to a tunnel of perfect focus, and then, for exactly 4 seconds, the wind stopped. The silence was absolute. No wind, no falling snow, just crystalline stillness that stretched across the frozen marsh like a held breath. Reyna had learned to recognize these moments, brief gaps in the chaos where the atmosphere itself seemed to pause. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5 at most, through her scope, magnified to maximum. The target was clear, the enemy commander, standing in the center of the compound, gesturing toward the prisoners who were being lined up against a wall. The posture, the body language. Reyna had seen execution preparations before. Her crosshairs settled on center mass. At 2,900 meters, attempting a headshot would be pure gambling. The torso offered a larger margin for error, though margin was relative when the target was smaller than a fingernail in her scope. She had already made every calculation possible. Now came the part that couldn't be calculated, the part that separated adequate snipers from legendary ones: intuition. Reyna exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs until she reached that perfect moment between breaths where the body was absolutely still. Her heart beat exactly once more. She could feel it, a slow thud in her chest, and then she squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, the recoil pushing back against her shoulder, the muzzle blast echoing off the rocks around her. Through the scope, she kept her eye on the target, watching. 1 second. The bullet was still climbing, arcing upward to clear the maximum ordinate of its trajectory. 2 seconds. The round was at its apex, beginning its descent, traveling at still over 1,200 feet per second. 3 seconds. The bullet was dropping fast now, fighting gravity and air resistance, the .338 Lapua Magnum round cutting through cold air. 4 seconds. The commander dropped like a puppet with cut strings. For a moment, nobody in the compound reacted. They didn't understand what had happened. The sound of the rifle shot wouldn't reach them for another 3 seconds. And even then, it would be impossible to determine direction. The echoes off the marsh would scatter the sound in every direction. One guard looked down at the fallen commander, confused. Another turned, scanning the area, and then the sound arrived, a distant crack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Chaos erupted. Raina was already working her bolt, chambering a second round. She'd planned for this. The enemy would scatter, taking cover, trying to understand where the threat was coming from, but she had a few more seconds of confusion to exploit. Her second target, the guard closest to Lieutenant Price, the one with his rifle pointed at the prisoners. Through the scope, she saw him turning, trying to process what was happening. She fired again. Another 4-second eternity, another impossible calculation made in the space between heartbeats. The guard went down. Now the compound was in full panic. Soldiers were running, some toward cover, others trying to drag the prisoners back inside the building. But 3 of them, she could see it clearly through her scope, had grabbed their own weapons and were making a break for it. Martinez, Cooper, and Hayes. They'd recognized the opportunity and taken it. Raina shifted her aim, tracking a third target, an enemy soldier who'd found cover and was drawing a bead on the escaping prisoners. She led the target slightly, accounting for his movement, and fired. Miss? The wind had shifted, just a breath, but enough to push her shot wide. She worked the bolt, chambered another round. The soldier was still aiming. She adjusted, squeezed. The soldier dropped his rifle and collapsed. 4 shots fired, 3 hits at 2,900 meters, a success rate that would seem impossible to anyone who didn't understand that impossible was just another word for difficult. But now the enemy was adapting. She saw soldiers setting up a heavy machine gun, pointing it in the general direction of her position. They couldn't see her. She was too far away, too well concealed. But they were going to spray fire toward the high ground. The first burst from the machine gun sent rounds cracking past her position, striking rocks 50 meters to her left. They were guessing, but even a guess could get lucky. Raina took one more shot, this one at a fuel truck in the compound. She'd noticed it earlier, marked it as a potential target. The .338 Lapua Magnum round wasn't incendiary, but at this distance, it would punch through the thin metal of the tank. The truck exploded in a fireball that sent soldiers diving for cover and created enough smoke to obscure the entire compound. In the confusion, the rest of Echo's squad made their move. Raina watched through her scope as Price led the remaining prisoners in a coordinated breakout, using the smoke as concealment. They were moving toward the marsh, toward the network of frozen waterways that would make them almost impossible to track. She'd done her part. Now it was time to do something even more difficult, survive long enough to link back up with them. Because the enemy was coming for her now. She could see them forming a pursuit team, grabbing cold weather gear and weapons. They knew approximately where the shots had come from, and they were angry. Raina began breaking down her shooting position, working with practiced speed. The exposed outcrop that had given her the perfect shooting platform was now a death trap. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached her. Time to move. Raina descended the outcrop, with controlled urgency, testing each foothold before committing her weight. A fall now would be catastrophic. Broken bones in this cold meant death, and she couldn't help her squad if she was crippled or dead. She'd made it about 30 meters down when the first bullet started hitting the rocks above her. The enemy had thermal optics and had picked up her heat signature. They were still too far for accurate fire, maybe 800 meters out, but they were closing fast. She dropped the last 10 feet, landing in deep snow that cushioned her fall but also slowed her movement. The marsh here was a nightmare of hidden ice shelves and deep water pockets. She could see the enemy's approach reflected in her knowledge of the terrain. They'd have to navigate the same obstacles, which bought her time, but not much. Reyna moved laterally, putting distance between herself and the obvious escape route. Most people, when fleeing, ran in a straight line away from pursuit. She angled perpendicular, heading toward an area of broken ice and standing water that would be treacherous to cross. Treacherous meant dangerous for everyone. That was the point. She reached the ice field and paused, reading the surface. The darker patches were thin ice or open water. The white areas were solid, probably. At her weight, with careful movement, she might make it across. The enemy, rushing in pursuit, would be less careful. She started across, testing each step, spreading her weight. Behind her, she heard shouts. They'd reached the ice field and were deciding how to proceed. One of them was impatient. She heard the ice crack, heard the splash, heard cursing and splashing, followed by panicked calls for help. One down, by his own mistake. The others would be more careful now, which meant slower. Good. Reyna reached solid ground on the far side and immediately moved to a position where she could observe the ice field. She needed to keep them cautious, keep them slow. Every minute she bought was another minute for Echo Squad to increase their lead. She found cover behind a fallen tree, set up her rifle, and waited. Through her scope, she watched 4 soldiers carefully making their way across the ice, weapons ready, moving in tactical bounds. Professional, disciplined, dangerous. She selected the lead soldier, the one others were following, trusting his path across the ice. She aimed not at him, but at the ice directly in front of him. The .338 Lapua Magnum would punch through the ice, maybe compromise its integrity. She fired. The ice in front of the lead soldier exploded in a shower of fragments. He jerked back instinctively, stumbled, and his weight shifted onto his rear foot. The ice beneath him cracked with a sound like breaking glass. He went through. The other 3 soldiers froze, suddenly realizing that their pursuit had become a minefield. They couldn't advance without risking the same fate. They couldn't retreat without showing their backs to her. Reyna took advantage of their indecision. She put a round into the ice near the second soldier, not trying to hit him, just making the ice around him fracture. He scrambled backward, terror overriding training. Now they were retreating, dragging their half-frozen comrade from the water, focused on survival rather than pursuit. But Reyna knew this respite was temporary. They'd regroup, find a safer route, come at her with more numbers and better tactics. She needed to link up with Echo Squad before that happened. She pulled out her compass and oriented herself toward the direction she'd seen her squad heading, northeast, deeper into the marsh, toward a series of low hills that offered better defensive positions. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that reduced visibility but also covered her tracks. She moved with purpose, following game trails when she found them, using terrain features to mask her heat signature from aerial observation. After 40 minutes of hard movement, she found it, a set of boot prints in fresh snow. 8 sets moving in tactical formation. Echo Squad was staying together, staying disciplined. Good. She followed their trail, catching up quickly now that she knew where they were heading. As she moved, She prepared for the next phase. These soldiers hunting her squad wouldn't give up. They'd suffered casualties, lost prisoners, been embarrassed by a single operator. They'd want revenge, and they'd bring everything they had. Reyna needed to be ready to give Echo Squad what they needed most: time and covering fire. She checked her ammunition. 19 rounds remaining, against potentially 15 or more enemy combatants. The math still wasn't in her favor, but she was getting used to that. Reyna found Echo Squad 3 kilometers northeast of the ranger station, holed up in a natural depression surrounded by dense pines. They'd chosen their position well. Good visibility of approaches, cover from above, multiple escape routes if needed. She announced herself before entering their perimeter, using the daily password, in case anyone was jumpy with a trigger finger. Lieutenant Price's face showed pure relief when she materialized from the snow like a ghost. He said her name and gripped her shoulder, noting that was one hell of a rescue. The squad was in rough shape. Martinez had a badly sprained ankle from the escape. Cooper had taken a glancing blow to his shoulder, not life-threatening, but painful. All of them showed signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. Reyna said they needed to move, that the enemy was regrouping for pursuit. They had maybe 30 minutes before they were on them. Webb noted they couldn't move fast with Martinez, and Cooper wasn't much better either. Price decided they would make the enemy pay for every meter they gained on them, asking Reyna what she needed. She replied that she needed time to set up defensive positions along their route. If she could slow them down, pick off their scouts, they might make it to the extraction point. The extraction point was a clearing 6 kilometers north, where a helicopter could potentially land. If they could call one in, and if the weather held, both were uncertain propositions. They began moving, with Reyna ranging ahead as advanced scout. Every few hundred meters, she'd find a position where she could observe their back trail, wait to see if pursuit appeared, and engage if necessary. The enemy was cautious now, having learned the cost of underestimating their prey, but they were still coming. She could see them through her scope, moving in extended line, using proper tactical spacing. She let them close to 600 meters, then took a shot at their point man. The soldier went down, and the entire line went to ground. They'd stay put for several minutes, trying to locate her position before resuming their advance. Reyna moved before they could triangulate where her shot came from. Another 500 meters up the trail. Another shot. This time, she aimed for equipment. She hit a soldier's radio pack, destroying their communications gear without killing the man. Psychological warfare was as effective as body count. The pattern continued for 2 hours. Reyna would move ahead, find a hide, engage at long range, then displace before return fire could find her. Each engagement bought Echo Squad precious minutes, pushed them closer to salvation. But the marsh was fighting them too. The route to the extraction point crossed several areas of thin ice, places where the water never fully froze. Even in winter, they had to move in single file, testing each step, moving with agonizing slowness while their pursuers gained ground. At one point, young Private Hayes, barely 19 years old, broke through the ice up to his chest. The shock of the cold water made him gasp in panic, thrashing, which only made things worse. Reyna reached him first, dropping prone to distribute her weight, extending her rifle stock for him to grab. She commanded him to stop moving, her voice cutting through his panic. She told him to look at her, to stop moving. He froze, wide eyes locked on hers. She told him to breathe slowly, to spread his arms on the ice. She told him he wasn't sinking. The water was only 4 feet deep. She told him to feel the bottom with his feet. She saw him process this, saw the panic ease slightly as his feet found solid ground beneath the water. She instructed him to push with his legs and pull himself toward her, slow and controlled. She told him he was going to be fine. It took 2 minutes of careful effort, but they got him out. He was soaked, shaking, but alive. They wrapped him in an emergency blanket and kept moving. Stopping meant death for all of them. Finally, as twilight approached, they reached a defensive position that Price declared good enough. A small hill crowned with boulders, offering 360-degree visibility and multiple layers of cover. If they had to make a stand, this was as good as it would get. Price ordered them to call for extraction. Webb tried every frequency, every emergency channel. Nothing but static. He reported that storms were interfering, or they were being jammed. Either way, they weren't getting air support tonight. Price absorbed this news with visible frustration. He ordered them to dig in and survive till morning, setting watch rotation. He told Reyna he wanted her on overwatch with full autonomy. If she saw a threat, she should engage at her discretion. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted to -20°C, Reyna found her position among the boulders and settled in for what would be the longest night of her life. Because the enemy was still out there, and they weren't giving up. They came at 0200 in the coldest, darkest hours when human vigilance was at its lowest. Reyna spotted them first, thermal signatures moving through the trees. At least 12 contacts, advancing in a coordinated assault formation. She said quietly into her radio that they had contact, multiple hostiles at 300 meters, moving to assault positions. Echo Squad came alert instantly, years of training overriding exhaustion. Price had arranged them in a defensive circle, each person responsible for a sector, overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook defensive doctrine. But with only 8 soldiers against a dozen or more attackers, the math was still ugly. Reyna had spent the last hour setting surprises along the likely approach routes. Nothing fancy. Just some tripwires connected to tin cans filled with rocks, some pressure triggers made from sticks and cord. The goal wasn't to kill, but to alert and slow. The first makeshift alarm went off at 280 meters. A soft clatter of rocks that signaled the enemy's advance. Reyna tracked the sound's origin through her scope, found the heat signature, took a breath, fired. One down. The enemy immediately went prone. But they didn't retreat. These were professionals who'd been humiliated once today and weren't going to let it happen again. They began a methodical advance under covering fire, using proper infantry tactics. The battle became a series of sharp exchanges, bursts of automatic fire lighting up the night, tracers cutting through falling snow like lethal fireflies. The crack of Reyna's rifle answered by the heavier thump of return fire against the boulders protecting her. She worked her rifle with mechanical precision, picking targets carefully, making every shot count. At these ranges, 200 to 400 meters, she was lethal, and the enemy knew it. They started focusing suppressive fire on her position, trying to keep her head down while other elements maneuvered. But Reyna had learned long ago how to work through incoming fire. You never completely ignored it. That was how you died. But you trained yourself to assess which rounds were actually dangerous and which were just noise. Most suppressive fire was just that noise. She took 3 more targets in quick succession, and the enemy assault stalled. They'd expected to overrun a position held by exhausted, demoralized prisoners. Instead, they'd run into a prepared defense anchored by a sniper who seemed to see in the dark and never missed. Their commander. Whoever had taken over after Reyna killed the first one, made a tactical decision. She saw it happening through her scope. Soldiers pulling back, regrouping, changing tactics. They were bringing up a marksman of their own. The first shot from the enemy sniper came so close that Reyna heard the supersonic crack of the bullet passing inches from her head. Professional grade shooting. Someone who knew their business. She immediately rolled left, changing position, putting a boulder between herself and the likely direction of fire. A second shot hit exactly where she'd been, spraying rock chips. This was different now. This was sniper versus sniper, the oldest and most personal form of combat. Reyna forced herself to slow down, to think. The enemy marksman had to be using thermal optics, same as her. He'd seen her muzzle flash, tracked her movement. He was probably expecting her to pop up in a different position for a counter shot. So she didn't. Instead, she waited, patient, letting minutes tick by, letting him wonder if he'd hit her or if she was maneuvering for a flank shot. Behind her, Echo Squad maintained suppressive fire, keeping the enemy infantry from advancing, but ammunition was finite, and the enemy seemed willing to trade rounds indefinitely. After 5 minutes, Reyna saw what she'd been waiting for, a brief thermal bloom, about 400 meters out, elevated position. The enemy sniper shifting his weight, adjusting his scope. She put her crosshairs on the heat signature and waited. He'd move again. They always did when they thought they'd been spotted. A subtle shift. Reyna fired. Through her scope, she saw the thermal signature collapse. The enemy sniper was down. The effect on the enemy assault was immediate and devastating. Without their precision shooter, they'd lost a critical asset. Their fire became less coordinated, their movements more hesitant. Price seized the moment, shouting for suppressive fire in all sectors to drive them back. Echo Squad opened up with everything they had, a concentrated wall of fire that any rational enemy would retreat from. And these enemies were rational. They'd taken heavy casualties for zero gain. They began pulling back, dragging wounded, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. But Reyna knew this wasn't victory. It was just a reprieve. Come daylight, the enemy would either assault with overwhelming force or simply call in artillery or air support. Echo Squad needed extraction, and they needed it before sunrise. As if reading her thoughts, Webb suddenly called out that he had signal. Patchy, but he had signal. Price shouted for him to request immediate extraction, emergency priority. They waited in tense silence while Webb worked the radio, praying the signal would hold long enough to get their message through. Webb finally announced that they copied. Helicopters were inbound. Estimated time of arrival was 45 minutes. Weather was breaking enough for them to fly. 45 minutes. They had to hold for 45 more minutes. The enemy would know. Sound traveled far in cold air. They'd hear the helicopters coming. They'd make one last push to prevent the extraction. Price ordered everyone to check ammunition, noting this was about to get real. Reyna had 6 rounds left in her magazine, 6 bullets between Echo Squad and whatever final assault the enemy was planning. She'd made impossible shots before. She just hoped she had a few more impossible left in her. The helicopters came in low and fast, skimming just above the tree line, their rotors creating a downwash that threw up clouds of snow and frozen debris. 2 Blackhawks, armed and angry, their door guns already tracking for threats. The enemy made their final play exactly as Reyna had predicted. They emerged from the tree line in a desperate assault, knowing this was their last chance to prevent the extraction. But now they were silhouetted against the morning sky, and Echo Squad was fighting with the desperate energy of people who could see salvation arriving. Reyna took her last 6 shots carefully, methodically, dropping 6 targets in a perfect rhythm that her instructors would have applauded. Then her rifle clicked empty, and she transitioned to her pistol, providing covering fire while the helicopters touched down. Price was shouting for them to move, coordinating the evacuation even as rounds kicked up snow around the landing zone. The door gunners opened up, their heavy machine guns laying down suppressive fire that finally broke the enemy assault. Soldiers scrambled aboard the helicopters. Martinez and Cooper were lifted bodily by their squadmates. Hayes, still wrapped in his emergency blanket. Everyone moving with the frantic energy of those who'd accepted they were going to die, and then been given an unexpected reprieve. Price was the last one standing outside the helicopter, refusing to board until his entire squad was accounted for. He shouted for Raina to move. She ran, her legs burning with exhaustion, her lungs aching from the cold air. She dove through the helicopter door just as the pilot pulled pitch, lifting them away from the kill zone. Below, the marsh receded, that frozen wasteland that had nearly become her grave, now just a white expanse marked with the dark scars of combat. She could see the enemy soldiers regrouping, staring up at the departing helicopters, knowing they'd lost. Inside the Black Hawk, Echo Squad was checking each other over, confirming everyone had made it, dealing with the shock and relief of survival. Someone handed Raina a bottle of water. Someone else draped a blanket over her shoulders. Price sat down next to her, had to lean close to be heard over the rotor noise. He mentioned that shot from 3 clicks out, saying he didn't think it was possible. Raina replied honestly that it wasn't. Statistically speaking, she should have missed. Wind was wrong. Conditions were wrong. Everything was wrong. Price shook his head in amazement, noting she made it anyway. 3 times. 3 hits at 2,900 meters. He said they were going to want a full debrief. The ballistics people were going to lose their minds. That might be one of the longest confirmed sniper kills ever recorded. Raina didn't respond. She was looking out the open door at the marsh below, thinking about David, thinking about all the shots she'd missed, all the mistakes she'd made, and thinking about the 8 people in this helicopter who were alive because she'd made 3 shots that everyone would have said were impossible. Webb leaned over, grinning despite his exhaustion. He said they were already calling it in on the command net. Silent Frost, that's what they were calling her. The Silent Frost sniper. Raina said that was stupid, but without heat. Webb replied that was military nicknames, and she should be glad it's not something worse. As the helicopter carried them toward safety, toward hot showers and warm food and medical care, Raina felt something shift inside her. The weight she'd carried since David's death, the guilt, the self-imposed isolation, the belief that she was too dangerous to work with others, it began to ease. She hadn't saved David, but she'd saved Echo Squad. Sometimes redemption didn't come from making up for past failures. Sometimes it came from simply being there when it mattered, being ready when the impossible became necessary. The sun broke through the clouds ahead, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, beautiful and lethal, like everything in this frozen wasteland. Price touched her shoulder, gestured to the squad. He told her she knew what she did back there. She gave them something no one else could: hope. When they were tied up in that compound, when they thought they were dead, she gave them hope that they'd survive. Raina looked at the faces around her. Martinez, Cooper, Hayes, Sullivan, Park, Webb, Price. 8 people who'd trusted her. 8 people who'd survived because she'd refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. She said quietly that she was just doing her job, sir. Price replied that no, she did something better than her job. She did the impossible. The helicopter banked toward the rising sun, carrying them home, carrying them away from the frozen marsh and the silent forest and all the places where death had seemed certain. Behind them, the killing ground faded into white. Ahead, the future waited. And somewhere in between, Raina Hale, the soldier they'd once called too cold to fight, had become the Silent Frost sniper. The woman who'd made the impossible shot when it mattered most. The one who'd been alone in the frozen dark. The one who'd refused to let her squad die. The one who'd hit a target at 2,900 meters in a winter storm and saved 8 lives with 3 bullets and 4 seconds of stillness. In the marsh below, The snow would cover the battlefield, erasing the evidence of combat, burying the blood and the shell casings and the frozen boot prints. But the story would remain. That story would spread through every military base, every training facility, every sniper school, becoming the legend that instructors would tell to students who insisted that certain shots were impossible.